Welcome back again for our conversations, looking at new technologies put on by ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science. I am Nicola Hoggard, co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science, and with me is Chris Mulheron, executive director of ISCAST, and Sarah Wilson, who's the program director for ISCAST. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Lynne Taylor. She is the Somerville Lecturer in Pastoral Theology at Otago University, teaching in the areas of pastoral care, mission, and ministry. Recently, Lynne has researched how New Zealand churches responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, including how they supported the well-being of their congregations and wider communities. Her PhD explored why previously unchurched Australians are becoming Christians today. In addition, Lynne engages in research and consultancy work with AngelWings Ltd. So we're very, very pleased to have Lynne with us today. Welcome, Lynne. So just let me pray, maybe while you're trying to share your screen, Lynne, I'll pray for us. Loving and gracious God, you draw us together in a multitude of ways, including these new strange ones by Zoom. You foster in us a sense of longing for you and for the body of Christ. And you have given us minds by which we can explore the wonders of your universe. Give us ears to hear what Lynne has to say tonight, and give her strength of voice as she explains her research, and make us all one in your love. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you tonight. I always like to talk about the research that I'm doing, the things that I'm exploring and discovering. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be with you in this space. So tonight I want to explore how churches adapted to online ministry as part of the COVID pandemic. I'm a practical theologian, and so that means that I am interested in the work of Christians and the work of the church in our world. Practical theology, according to John Swinton and Harriet Mowat, seeks to discern and participate in the Missio Dei by engaging in critical theological reflection on the experiences and practices of the world and the experiences and practices of the church. And so that's the kind of framework that I bring to my work as a practical theologian, trying to work out what God is up to in the world, trying to see how the church and Christians can best engage in processes that lead to goodness and to the flourishing of the world. We need to think about what and why is the church? What does the church exist for? And obviously there's denominational and individual distinctives around that question, that different churches have different things that they prioritize, different values that are really important to them. But there are some core things that are important to all churches. And those things are things that should influence the work of the church. And even when there's a massive global disruption, like a pandemic, we hope that some of those values, those key aspirations and desires, those key structures and values of the church will hold churches, even in the midst of a new and changed time. So I think that the church is about engagement in the mission of God. I think it's about offering a place for worship and discipleship. I think it's about engaging in things that help to support the holistic well-being of people in the church, but also not just those in the church, but also those in the wider community as well. And so that's what I think of in terms of the church. And you'll have slightly different things or very different things that you want to emphasize and to value in thinking about the why and what of the church. When COVID hit, I wondered how churches would respond to the pandemic. I was interested in the motivations for what they did and in the actions that they took. I was interested in how they communicated the message of faith, how they connected with people in their congregation and people on the fringes of their congregation and people in their wider communities. I was interested in how they explored new forms of worship and ministry and how they supported the holistic well-being of people in their orbits. So how did they adapt to online ministry? How did they engage in pastoral care and worship and mission in the midst of a vastly changed context? I was also interested in the why that lay behind that. Why did they do what they did? Why was it that they took the particular steps that they engaged in? And I was aware of these three broadly defined areas of church life. Churches as offering pastoral care, churches as engaging in offering spaces for worship, broadly defined, churches as providing places for missional engagement. And so those three spheres of church life held my reflections during that time. Nicola popped in the chat some 3 articles that I've published out of this research, and there are more to come. There's presentations that have or will become publications as well. And so around pastoral care, around mission, and around worship, and around ministry generally. So if you're interested, there's links to access all of those articles freely without institutional access as well. And yeah, so they provide some more information, some more, you'll hear echoes of some of the things that I'm talking about tonight in some of those papers as well. But before we look to the post-COVID scene, I want to back up and to ask the question, is online ministry new? I want to look at some motivations for online ministry, and I want to hold a well-being focus in mind as well for us, that the role of the church in contributing to the holistic well-being of people in its community, broadly defined. So online church is not new. Some people seem to think that it hadn't actually been done before, but online church is not new. And it's certainly not new for Christians to adopt fresh means of communication. As Lynne Barb points out in her book, Reaching Out in a Networked World, Augustine's use of rhetoric, the printing press producing Bibles and pamphlets, radio and television technologies were all embraced by the church and by Christians as a means to break new ground in communicating the gospel and the Christian faith. Christian use of the internet began in the 1980s when computer enthusiasts in the Christian church began to explore ways to use this new means of communication to express their religious interests. It began with networking and as networking, discussion groups and email newsletters, listservs and the like. In 1986, which is a very long time ago, there was an online memorial liturgy in remembrance of the Challenger disaster. This included liturgy, prayers, scripture, and meditation, and concluded with a coffee hour when individuals could post their own reactions to the tragedy. 1986, it's a long time ago. In 1992, the first virtual Christian congregation was established. The first church of cyberspace was a Presbyterian church in New Jersey in the United States. And then following massive developments in technology, by 2004, the Methodists in the UK ran a 3-month experiment in avatar-based worship. It was called Church of Fools, and I'm going to show you a little clip from one of their early services. You can see in that some of the challenges that are part of online worship space as well, that the people who were not exactly playing along as should be, when someone says, when I say something in capitals and they say something in capitals in response, rather than actually saying what they're supposed to be saying. This is a a challenge. Part of the challenge of the online space is that we can have people who are engaging in ways that are not as was intended. So online church is not new. While some perceive that they discovered it for themselves in 2020, online expressions of faith and spirituality have been around for decades, and there was quite innovative stuff that was happening in this space as well. The Digital Church Network helpfully talk about the digital space in relation to these three areas of metaverse, digital, and phygital. So the universe has become a metaverse. Digital communities are here to stay, and on-site gatherings are not all that the future requires, and nor are they the only places where God is at work. The metaverse is an immersive virtual world that's facilitated by the use of virtual reality and augmented reality headsets. There's a focus there on social community. In the digital space, this is things like social media, Facebook groups, and other cloud and app-based communities provide an opportunity to engage in community, an online community, and to build relationships, and for Christians to be the church in an online space. And then the phygital, where digital communities are supplemented by physical gatherings. These could be micro, like house churches, or they could be linked to existing on-site churches, bringing the best of both worlds, bringing the best of the digital world and the physical world into mission and ministry. So online church is not new, and nor is online church going away. In 2020, of course, online church became essential. Previously, it had been well researched and theorised. Heidi Campbell and Tim Hutchins are two key scholars who are working in this space. Previously, however, religious communities chose to adopt online platforms rather than having them forced on them, as occurred in 2020. During COVID, adaptations that were previously unimagined by most churches were readily accepted and adopted as necessary responses to a changing context. And some saw and some see this change as an opportunity to reimagine the church's form, encouraging ongoing agility and adaptation. Others returned to on-site only worship as soon as was permitted. And many are tired, very, very tired. Many pastoral leaders are enormously tired and struggling with the reality of this new world that we find ourselves in. I want to talk about what were identified to be motivations for online church before COVID hit. And Tim Hutchins is really helpful here. He identified 3 common ambitions for online churches before COVID: the desire to amplify, to connect, and to experiment. Amplification uses online broadcast technologies to increase the audience of a generally established preacher previously. Connection seeks more than one-way communication, providing ways for genuine communities to be formed, including between people who are isolated, perhaps by distance, disability, or ideology. Experimentation engages with new media, exploring what new rituals and initiatives might be possible, as well as reflecting theologically on those possibilities. Pre-COVID, some churches live streamed their services to the internet. Other church services were broadcast on television. Churches used websites, email, and social media platforms to communicate to their members and to others. And some communities operated wholly online. In doing so, churches were communicating religious content through a mediated content within a mediatized context. Mediatized because the media impacts social realms, including religion. During COVID-19, restrictions on in-person gatherings made amplification essential. Church buildings were closed. If ministers wanted to be heard, they needed to adopt some form of communication technology. But COVID-19 confirmed that amplification or unidirectional broadcasting of a media-savvy message is insufficient and perhaps even counterproductive. While providing high-quality streaming of worship services makes logical sense in a pandemic-affected mediatized world, it became apparent, as Steve Evoy noted, that trying to produce the best streaming services is not the best way for pastors to move their ministries online. Rather, what people were longing for, Evoy said, was something familiar, something that feels as normal as possible, seeing the pastor and a few familiar faces speaking to them. As Zach Lambert realised, our content is important, but our connection is imperative. connection was imperative. And this wasn't new news to many. Pre-COVID, Angela Gorrell recognised that the major possibility that new media use affords is connection. And similarly, cautioning against the tendency to instrumentalise technology in communicating the gospel, Catherine Schmidt emphasised encounter, focusing not on content delivery, but on relationality. And Heidi Campbell recognises the internet as a social network where connecting with people becomes the primary goal. Such connection is something that Christians should appreciate. Theologically, a human desire for connection can be understood as reflecting a created status as human persons made in the image of a relational God. God is Trinity, relational, and we're created in the image of this relational God. Connecting person to person is something that we're created to do. Maggie Dawn, writing pre-COVID in relation to online worship, extends the implications of this relationality as not merely driving connection towards other people, but also towards the divine. For Dawn, worship, including online worship, involves joining in with a relationship of eternal love and adoration, and is a potential site for Christians and non-Christians alike of encounter with God. So the online space can be a space of connection with God and with people. And creating space for such connection was a motivation for Christians' online engagement pre-COVID and recognised to be very important during COVID. The third pre-COVID motivation for churches' online engagement was experimentation, trying new things. However, as Marshall McLuhan noted, people often use new media to remake the old world rather than open up the imaginative possibilities that new media affords. Again, writing pre-COVID, Johnny Baker called for deep theological and missiological reflection and imagination on the missional possibilities offered by digital technologies. The process of translating ministry into any new context, including the digital, requires both a deep immersion in the gospel and a letting go of familiar forms of language and culture. Such an approach requiring presence, attention, imagination, and then translation was certainly unable to be achieved in the days between governments announcing lockdown and church services. There was a need for ongoing iterative change, a need for ongoing skillful reflection on experiences, understandings, and theologies. So amplification, connection, and experimentation, 3 pre-COVID motivations for churches' engagement in the online space. Behind each of those things, there has to be a why, though. There has to be a deeper reason for them. We don't just amplify any old message. We don't just connect for the sake of connecting. We don't experiment just for fun. The amplification needs to be of a message that's a good message. We need to connect in ways that are helpful and healthy. We need to experiment for a purpose that is for good. And here we come back to our questions around what's the purpose of the church, both generally and specifically, the purpose and the values of the church and of churches, the priorities that each holds, shape the worship of the community, and they shape the online expression of the community as well. So what are the things that hold, what are the values that hold churches and inspire them to act in particular ways? I want to just nod to holistic well-being as a purpose for what the church does in this space as well, in terms of offering mission and ministry to people in its congregations and communities. And I want to point to Sir Mason Jury's work on holistic well-being, Te Whaletapa Whā, as a model of well-being that recognises the integration of human persons as involving social, spiritual, mental, and physical aspects. I'm not going to talk about that in any depth now, but just to note it because it did shape some of the questions that I asked of churches as we explored their mission and ministry together. So I had these possible motivations: amplification, connection, experimentation, a desire to engage in what God was doing in the world, and a desire to support holistic well-being, spiritual, social, physical, and mental, as things that churches might want to be doing in the online space when COVID hit. I ran an online questionnaire responded to by about 75 New Zealand and Australian churches. And from that, I engaged in a case study. I selected 3 churches to engage a case study of the particular work of these 3 churches in neighbouring suburbs who were positive to the recognised that there were positive aspects of worshipping online, had recordings of their services available. And my cat is scratching at my door. That's why I'm a little bit distracted. She wants to come in and I'm just going to ignore her. So 75 churches in the online questionnaire, 3 churches engaged in 4 content analysis, focus group interviews, leadership interviews, and content analysis of their services. In analysing, we took a critical realist approach, which meant that there was room for God to be at work, where people indicated that they had experiences they attributed to the activity of God. Critical realism provides a philosophical framework for adopting Swinburne's principles of credulity and testimony, providing room for spiritual experiences and the subsequent descriptions of them to be believed. Secondly, critical realism also recognises that the experiences described by people are constructed and co-constructed in context and in relationship. And so we were attentive to the participants' context and lived realities as we worked with the data. We coded initially to the 3 themes from Hutchins, and then also did inductive and iterative coding within those codes as well. And what we discovered from the questionnaire data was in the early days of COVID, it was important that churches had a way of a means of preaching or communicating the faith with existing church members, with people on the fringe, and to a lesser extent with people who were not part of their church. More important was providing a means of becoming or remaining connected with existing people in their churches, with people on the fringes of their churches, and again, to a lesser extent, with new people to them. It was less important that they explored new forms of worship and or ministry, but for some that was still extremely important and seen as an opportunity to embrace. So thinking primarily around those areas of well-being and pastoral care, or supporting the holistic well-being of people, there was evident in the data an impulse towards encouraging participation and connection both during and outside of worship. Sermons and other communications from church leaders emphasised honesty. They addressed the lived reality of the congregation. They amplified a message of God's presence and activity, and they sought to comfort, strengthen, and reassure the hearers. Experimentation and iterative change were evident and ongoing. However, in a time of unprecedented change, familiar songs and worship practices provided consistency and familiarity, and care was taken not to unnecessarily burden congregations and leaders. In terms of connection, leaders were attentive to the importance of active participation and connection, and the participants appreciated it. While churches reported generally having less people involved on screen than would normally be involved up front in their on-site worship, there was often really intentional involvement of others, including people who would not usually have been called on to help out. And so different people had become experts in the space, and different people had become helpers in the space. It opened up opportunities for service, for leadership, and for involvement of people who would normally not have been involved in upfront worship leadership. For many churches, Zoom chats or something similar took place after worship in a way that was similar to morning tea after the services. But one minister noticed that the conversations were much more about the service and the reflection than would have been the case pre-COVID. So where pre-COVID, it would have been social chat about social things. During COVID, there was much more ongoing engagement with the service content, with the things that have been talked about. And she saw that as a positive. In terms of enjoying connections, it was important for people to be able to see others' faces, particularly for those who were isolating alone. One person said, it helps you to realise that you weren't on your own. That was a big thing. And during lockdown, it was easy to become quite introspective, and getting together for church on Sunday was really great. It was a space where people could see one another, could engage with one another, with people they knew. And the sense of solidarity and shared experience came up here too. It was named negatively in terms of reduced capacity, but it was also seen as a positive. People are in the same position as me. They understand what I'm going through, and I can engage with them on a Sunday and talk about that. Another thing churches did in the connection space was offering faithful presence. And this was maintained through a whole host of various means. For example, social media, emails, Facebook posts, Zoom meetings. Churches often had regular time slots where ministers or others would offer reflections or just be present for engagement with people in their communities. When community-facing ministries were unable to run, some churches continued to offer resources, emails, and phone calls, maintaining contact whenever it was possible. However, at the same time, participation wasn't always active, and one minister reported having heard people say, "Oh, online church is great because I just put it on and put it in my pocket and carry on about my day." And so there was a convenience there, but a lack of engagement, a lack of interaction. That particular minister wasn't quite convinced that that was actually a good thing. In terms of amplifying, the sermons and the communications from the earliest services were about emphasizing honesty and addressing the lived reality. There wasn't an attempt to sugarcoat what was going on for people. There was very much a, this is hard. You might remember the startled rabbit look of those early church services when you had ministers lined up on their sofa going, "Oh my gosh, what are we doing?" And just trying to offer something to their congregations that wasn't polished, but was real. They were naming their struggle. They were naming the difficulty along the way. One minister began her recording of her first reflection. She decided not to record the service, but she recorded the reflection and put it up afterwards for others to view. She said, "I decided not to record the service because I wanted to respect the privacy of the people that were going to be there, and because we had no idea how it was going to go. So it seemed wise not to record it." And then she said, "Oh, you're seeing my messy office behind me," as she looks over her shoulder. And so there was this sense of reality as people were naming this context that they found themselves in. The first service in the middle-sized Anglican church that I interviewed, the service leader spoke of the literal wilderness that they were in, naming specific realities that people in the congregation might be facing relating to anxiety, adjustment, change, and trauma. And one participant named how important that was for them in feeling a sense of, or in strengthening them in terms of their well-being. That was named from the front, some of those things that they were experiencing and feeling. So they were amplifying a message that was a real message. It wasn't a shiny and glossy message. They also amplified a message of God's activity and presence. They talked about the provision of timely texts and themes that were part of those early services. The lectionary text about finding ourselves in the valley of dry bones, which was so apt for churches across the world experiencing the COVID lockdown for the first time. These messages sought to comfort and reassure the people who were part of the congregation. And then in terms of experimentation, church leaders sought to balance continuity in relation to service time and format with the challenges and opportunities that the online space offered. They gave things a go. One leader told me about starting a Zoom Bible study to replace their midweek communion service. And he told me, "You know what, it worked." What surprised me was that our 70 and 80-year-olds and even 90-year-olds were Zooming in for a Bible study. Who would have thought? And at the time that I interviewed him, a year later, that online midweek communion service or Bible study was still happening online. While some ministers gleefully accepted the opportunity to experiment with online worship and pastoral care, others were reluctant. But even sometimes that apparent reluctance was actually for pastoral reasons. One Australian Lutheran church, when asked how important it was that they explored new forms of worship and or ministry, said it was not so important. And they went on to comment that they tried to minimize change where possible, as there was already so much disorienting change occurring in church and society. Now, I looked at the service that they offered for review, and it seemed like that was actually a pastoral attempt to ensure continuity rather than an avoidance of innovative change. In this instance, a small group of minister, musicians, and technical supporters offered a live stream of their Easter Sunday worship service. And while it included some pre-recorded elements, it was led from the church building, as it would have been if they'd been on site in person. And it followed a familiar form of liturgy. And in this shot here, this is during the children's talk, when the minister sat on the floor at the front, presumably just as he would have done for on-site worship. He spoke directly to an external camera while he was using his laptop to read aloud and respond to, in real time, comments that children were making. So it was almost like the children were there with him in the spot where they would have been normally. So he talked of minimizing changes, but it was for the sake of pastoral care, and he was embracing many of the capabilities that the online space offered. There was a keen awareness of the need not to burden congregations with more things to do as well. And so while many things were possible, there was a desire to keep things manageable. How much is enough was the wise question of one of the leaders that I interviewed. The motivations did change a bit over time. So early on there was it became less important that existing people were connected with, and more important that fringe and new people were connected with, both in terms of amplification and sharing the message of faith. I can talk about that a little bit more in Q&A if you like. But I just want to finish by talking briefly about X-rays and sparks, because Jacqueline Rose insightfully argues that the pestilence of Albert Camus' novel Plague is at once blight and revelation. It brings the hidden truth of a corrupt world to the surface. And along with many others, Marmot and Allen agree that the COVID-19 pandemic similarly exposes the fault lines in society and amplifies inequalities. I think the COVID-19 pandemic acted as an X-ray, revealing what was already there below the surface in our personal lives, our churches, and in our wider society. And our responses to the pandemic as individuals and as churches and as governments came out of our values, the bones that gave us shape. And similarly, the problems that we faced were rooted not only in a virus, but also in processes and systems that predated the pandemic. At a church level, I saw this X-raying of values in the data that I gathered, in the questionnaire responses and in the case study churches. We saw this at one particular church where the DNA of the church was expressed in its missional commitments, where the emphasis on connection extended not just to those within the church, but to those beyond the church, where the values that they espoused were loudly echoed in the actions that they took. We saw that sort of impulse for missional engagement echoed in many churches that sought to connect not just with those in or on the fringes of their congregations, but with those beyond their churches as well. So in such instances, the things that were already part of these churches, part of these people, were revealed during COVID. They were X-rayed. Those core values, those bones were revealed, and they provided the structure for what happened in the uncertainty of the COVID times. COVID also acted as an accelerant, acting both for good and for ill. It acted as an accelerant for ill, having the potential to destroy or to accelerate evil, including by providing a context for spreading political and medical disinformation, whether intentionally or inadvertently. But it also acted for good as it provided fuel for sparks of goodness, ideas, and initiatives that might not otherwise have come to anything. One church, it acted as an accelerant for them as they developed their online ministry and worship, and where they fast-tracked ideas that had been part of simmering away for some time, but suddenly had a new impetus and a new need. So in that way, COVID acted as an accelerant, accelerating things that were already in the pipeline. And I just want to end with a current snapshot of Baptist churches in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because in 2022, over half of the Baptist churches that provided their church statistics reported that they have at least one congregation available online. Altogether, there were 150 congregations or services online, some churches having more than one. And of those, a vast majority were live streams of worship services that were held on site. Further 12% were worship services that were recorded and uploaded later. And the remainder were online only. So here's a massive change, in the past 3 years, from a handful of Baptist churches that would have been offering online worship to 114 churches, 150 online services. Something has changed, something has shifted in our landscape that we won't be going back from entirely. But at the same time, there's much space for innovation, for change, for development, for the sorts of things that Johnny Baker was talking about in terms of missional reflection on the new space that the digital world opens up for us, and opportunities to ask really big and deep and ongoing questions about what it might mean to be the church in the future in spaces such as those. So thank you very much for listening attentively, and yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you now.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was really interesting. Can I just ask what was the most surprising thing you learned, Lynn, from all of this?
I always struggle with the most surprising thing because I feel like I have to have the exact answer of the most surprising thing.
Anything surprising? What was the
Look, I was blown away by the work that unexpected people put in to open up spaces for people to engage. The stories of the 70, 80, 90-year-olds on Zoom having their Bible study, people who just discovered that they had an ability to do stuff that they never would have imagined that they could possibly do beforehand. It's like, they just had to, and they did. And that was across the board. There are so many stories of people just stepping up and working hard and working well, forgiving each other and themselves, and having the space to do that.
Great, thank you. Sylvia, you have a question.
Yeah, kia ora, Lynn. Sorry about my light. My question is around different generations. What did you know? You mentioned about trying to engage the children. I do remember vividly online services where kids were able to participate either in a sort of a pre-recorded thing from children. But to be honest, in the churches that I attended, I didn't see much youth participation. So there's obviously, what I observed was some kind of core committed families trying to find ways to stay involved online, but obviously the kids themselves got quite a lot of online fatigue as well. And so you saw over the COVID time, some of the kids getting less enthusiastic about performing in front of the screen, is my observation. What did you notice?
Yeah, that shift was definitely something that happened. And, I'm talking with youth ministers who just had to keep changing things all the time to adapt and to change. And that first experience of it was a bit exciting because it was like it was all new and stuff, and then it's like, we're still here, we're here again, especially for churches in Auckland, and it would be the case in in Australian cities that were also had more lockdowns. So the need to be constantly adapting, but not to be not it wasn't that they were doing new and bright and shiny things. It was that they were just trying to keep tweaking and keep changing. I think the things that worked quite well were around where families were would do something together and then bring something back and share it with the wider group. So it wasn't that they were on screen doing something necessarily, but that they were doing something, but then also sharing it, contributing it. But mixing it up seemed to be quite important, which was, I imagine, very tiring for people.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed what you said, Lynn. My husband and I attend an inner city Baptist church in Melbourne that went online early in the COVID lockdown. We were in the time transitioning from our evangelical Anglican suburban church to this other church, but it pretty quickly went in, and it has continued. It made a conscious decision to continue totally online. The reasons I think that it's succeeded is, firstly, it's got a small congregation, about 30 people. The services were always, it calls itself Bapto-Catholic. It's a different sort of Baptist church. It has a liturgy, very liturgical service, and that everyone participates in that liturgy. You're sent 2 or 3 things to say before the service, and you join in. So it's a Zoom service, so everyone feels involved. And then there are breakout rooms, usually 2 or 3. We switch around after the service. So, and in our case, we feel it was a very conscious, long drawn out decision, including trialing hybrid services. But the truth was that the congregation would have been at least halved had we gone back to online, to face-to-face. We have people there who have disability in hearing or seeing. We have people who've moved to the country to look after elderly relatives. We have people from overseas who can't get to a church overseas. And we have older people who said they would not be able to make it to the church before, and now there are enthusiastic ones. We have a toddler who can say a 5-word sentence, peace be with you, and gets a lot of enjoyment doing that. And it really works well. But I would say it's because of the Zoom, because of the liturgy. Our pastor is a gifted liturgist. And I think that's probably why it works. So just one more comment is that the church used to have, when it was in person, because it's more Bapto-Catholic, it would have 3 services during the week, each day, Matins, Compline and Vespers, and Vespers and Compline, and they have actually become pastoral care hubs and much better attended. I guess the challenges are, what are we going to do with the building? What are we going to, it's in a suburb called South Yarra. What are we going to do? We don't actually have a connection with South Yarra. I would say most congregation members are extremely socially conscious within their own realm, but what do we do about that? So there are sort of issues that we have to face as a church, but I can say, actually, it's fantastic. It's really good. We don't feel that Zoom is a bad way of connecting. And of course, we try and connect with other activities now that lockdowns are over. So I'm sorry I've gone on a bit long, but I'm very enthusiastic about it. And I will put in the chat a link to an interview that was done with our pastor by an American guy from a group called the Lakeland Institute. I'll just put up a link to that and you can hear the explanation of the process.
Thanks, Jenny. That's a great example of some of the reasons why the online church continues to work for people, the accessibility for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to attend because they're in a different place, or they are disabled, or have an illness that prevents them from meeting in person. That the structure of a liturgy, the participation, that everybody gets to be involved and to do something, the opportunities for pastoral care in a regular and structured way. You know that there is going to be something, there is going to be a place where you can go and connect with people and chat. And and those elements are for those people for whom they're important, they hold them. They provide the structure and the possibility for online worship in that space. So that was that's a great example. Thanks, Jenny.
Lindsay and Carol ask a pretty big question, which is, what do you see as the future of online in New Zealand and Australia?
Well, I mean, it is what we make it, I think, and we won't ever get there in terms of having made it. There's going to always be room for a huge amount of experimentation and playfulness and digging in and giving things a go and sticking with things and stopping something because it's not connective for people anymore. So I hope that the future of online in New Zealand and Australia is diverse. I hope that it is thoughtful. I hope that it's careful in terms of having values behind it that are good and that hold it as a safe space. There are people in the online church space who don't have, they may imagine they have the good of others in their minds, but there are problematic dimensions to some of the things that are happening. There are cults that are at work in the online space trying to encourage people to engage and participate, and they're not going to be healthy places for people. There are, in the metaverse type space, there are initiatives that require you to pay, your Bitcoin to go to church and have worship experiences. And church is not that's not what it is about. And so there is a need for care, there's a need for ongoing reflection, there's a need for big, hard conversations. But there is loads of space and opportunity as well for diversity.
I can't see Bronwyn, but she's sort of saying a shudder, PTSD from a lockdown capital of Melbourne. and she didn't. It didn't work for her. Did you encounter this as well? This kind of reaction? Yeah.
And especially as time went on, carried on, and those pressures of the inequity that was experienced by people. There's some people who loved lockdown because they had all this time to do things, and then other people who had to do their normal job plus organise their children's schooling, plus make sure that their elderly parents had groceries delivered. There was a huge complexity and huge challenge for people. And yet people absolutely became zoomed out and were over it. And again, we see diversity. I think some of the ways that things worked well in those difficult times was, again, opening space for multiplicity. And so, yes, there was something that was happening. You knew that the pastor was going to be online at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday to chat, but that wasn't the only engagement that you had. One church that I researched had, their home group had a triathlon that they all did a part of it, and they were totally socially distanced, but they'd cheer and yell as someone rode past on their bicycle, and they'd be out on their decks or on their lawns, celebrating this event that was something that they were doing together, but that was quite different than just the online space. So obviously, again, you need to have time and energy to do that. But there was there were some examples of freshness and difference that were good for people, but absolutely many people were just completely over it and needed to go and hide under the covers.
Thank you. Charles, do you want to give your question?
My question was concerning violent reactions against the idea of online or digital. Did some people have theological objections to that they thought the importance of face-to-face actually getting together? Did you encounter reactions like that or not?
The churches that took part in the survey and the online questionnaire were generally probably participating because they thought there was something good about it, or not, something not bad about it. I suspect that people who had the most violent reactions against it probably didn't complete my survey. That said, there were certainly some ideas around the importance of that we have to be physically in the same room to be able to say that we're meeting together as a church. And I think that's hugely problematic for all sorts of reasons, including theological ones about, transcendent God who's present with us wherever we are, sort of thing. There were some churches that opted not to do anything. So one church said that they trusted that God would lead the people that God would minister to their congregation individually, rather than having any sort of church responsibility towards them. So I don't think that was that they were against online church. I think they just probably thought that it wasn't actually going to last very long, and that for a short period it would be all right to not do anything. I don't know whether they then went on and made changes.
Yeah, like, did anyone decide to break the law and keep meeting together physically? Or did you have lateral, like I remember at one stage when hotels were allowed to have a greater density of people, that you decide go to the beer garden, order your lemonade and have church there?
Yes, that there were some churches that found some creative ways around the regulations, which wasn't ideal. I was going to say the New Zealand context was a bit flatter in terms of we weren't able to go and have beer in the beer garden. It was like no, nothing.
Bill Walker, do you want to give your question quickly, because you're reacting as a social scientist?
Yeah, look, I'm just sort of interested in this whole area of motivation for collective action. If we can think of worship as a form of a motivated participation in collective action with all the complexities that involves, do you have any thoughts on this recent sort of cross-cultural, they've been hoovering up a lot of evidence cross-culturally across the world, because there's different debates going on about whether motivation difference varies in different societies and different contexts. So it's very relevant to a kind of critical realist approach. Do you have any thoughts on that, sort of those kind of core? I mean, this is kind of work in progress to do with identity and identity formation, to do with morality and justice, to do with emotions and self-efficacy. Now, it seems to me that you've kind of alluded to some of these, but I just thought you may have some more focused comments.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to pick off the self-efficacy thing there as one discrete part, there was certainly evidence of that it was super important for people participating in worship to have some sense of self-efficacy, and church provided that for some people. That participating, they could choose to participate in some way, and there was something that they did have some sort of control over, which I think was a positive in that space. I'm trying to think. I have written something on that somewhere, but I can't exactly remember where. But that's a great question that I'd like to take away and think some more about.
Okay, thanks.
Unfortunately, we have to finish up here because we've run out of time. But thank you again so much, Lynne, for such a fascinating talk and for bringing us the results of your research into such a current ongoing event, so to speak. It's great that you're being able to do all this research and get these results so that we can reflect on this and where we're going from here. I think Chris would like to briefly talk about the upcoming conference, and then Phil Church is going to pray for us as we finish tonight.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, look, it'd be great if I could just encourage you all to not only join us at COSAC in Melbourne, perhaps, or online, but also to let other people know about it. A couple of things we're really trying to do this time. We're really trying to engage younger people. There will be plenty for everybody, but we would really like to engage younger people. And the second day of COSAC is particularly pitched at them. We've got some excellent speakers. We have Tony Rinaldo in person. We have Alistair McGrath and Jennifer Wiseman zooming in at different times of the conference. And the other thing we're doing is we're offering prizes or awards of $7,000 total to students, any sort of student, for projects in science and faith. So they don't have to do their project by the time of the conference. They have to propose their project, and then they will receive an award. Some of them will receive an award. The main award will be probably $4,000 for a project that will be completed over the next year. So we'd really appreciate anything you can do to let people know about these things. Let me just point you to the ISCAST website. You'll find the conference details there. You'll find a flyer you can download and send by email to people, etc.
Thank you, Chris. And Phil, could we just end with prayer? Thanks.
Thanks, Nicola. Loving God, thank you for reminding us tonight that in these strange and difficult times of the last 3 years that you have been present and are still present, and you are still at work with your people and still at work in the world. I'm reminded that Jesus said, I will build my church, and not even a pandemic will prevail against it. Thank you for the things we have heard tonight and the things we've learned. Thank you for Lynne's work and the insights she's been able to share with us. And so as we finish, we offer to you our love and our evening worship in the name of Jesus. Amen.